Hi, welcome to History in a Snap, and today we'll be going over the origins of the Russian Revolution up through the start of the Civil War. So, as you can see here, I have some political posters from World War One and the Revolution, as well as a political cartoon of the Russo-Japanese War. So it's important to know that Russia, since its inception, was ruled by czars or emperors who had absolute power over all of Russia, and for centuries, these czars brutally repressed any form of rebellion, reform, or other forces within the Russian Empire gaining political power. Much like France, when you learn about the French Revolution and the three estates of the clergy, the nobility, and then everyone else from the middle class to the peasants and the serfs. Russia was stratified in a similar way, where the Tsar, followed by the nobility and the Russian Orthodox Church, ruled over the peasantry. Much of said peasants were serfs, slaves or debtors who had no forms of rights and were tied to their land that they worked, who faced serious abuse, and entire generations experienced serfdom in the same small villages and even the same houses, lived in by parents and then their children and then their children's children and their children's children and so forth. Now, in about 1860, Tsar Alexander II decided to abolish serfdom, as he believed that a free populace was more willing and able to fight after he witnessed the free armies of United Europe defeat Russia during the Crimean War, and he hoped that a free populace would be able to innovate and build a stronger economy to help the Tsardom expand into more territories and Russify those populations, whether that be through genocide, re-education, or replacing non-Russians with ethnic Russians. Now, he did run into a bit of a problem there, where in a compromise with the nobility, the debt that those serfs had still carried on even after they were freed from serfdom, so this led to many poor people. And so we fast forward to the early 1900s as Russia is expanding east into an area of China known as Manchuria, and they wanted to build a railroad to connect their largest eastern city, known as Vladivostok, that is the home of a lot of trade with the Americas or with Asia, and is home to their Far Eastern and Navy. And as they began building what is known as the Trans-Siberian Railway, connecting Vladivostok to the rest of Russia, Japan started to make demands for Manchuria, especially around the area that the railroad was being built through. And Japan was a new upstart empire after centuries of isolation, and they demanded Manchuria from both Russia and China, as they hoped to establish their own colonies in the area after taking Korea. Now, Russia, seeing itself as a superior power, being European, being a longer living empire, tells Japan to go kick rocks, and is then caught off guard when Japan launches a surprise invasion into Russia. And there's a big difference between the two armies, as Japan has the latest equipment from the Western world. They've received training from the French and German armies, naval training by the U.S. and British navies, and their population is fiercely driven to both want to get the respect of their emperor and respect of the world, as they're seen as a upstart empire with no background, so they need to prove themselves in this new conflict. Russia, meanwhile, has its army made up of conscripts, dirt poor ex-serfs, and various minorities throughout Russia that were already being persecuted. And their armed forces were extremely unmotivated, poorly trained, and highly corrupt. And the Russian Navy is still equipped with muskets or older cannons, and so are fiercely outmatched both in range and accuracy by the Japanese rifles. And their only supply route to and from Siberia is a single railway connecting it to the rest of Russia. And so they need to choose between evacuating injured troops or bringing in new supplies. And so they get into a whole debacle as thousands of troops who could have survived were left to freeze in the cold and let their wounds get infected, leading to a mass unrest throughout Russia. And the Japanese launched these just seemingly random and reckless attacks against superior Russian forces. And while they do take heavy casualties, they decimate the Russian forces, with the Russians having their navy sunk, with only a handful of ships escaping and managing to survive in harbors, with even the Russian Baltic fleet all the way in Europe sailing around the world to go try and save the Pacific fleet, only for it to be sunk after finally arriving after months. And their army is routed by the Japanese Imperial Army and are forced to give up all of Manchuria to the Japanese, or else they face just losing even more of their eastern territory, potentially all of Siberia. Now, this utter humiliation leads to mass unrest across Russia, culminating in the 1905 revolution. Protests and riots break out all across Russia as the Tsar not only refused to give in to the demands of the people for representation, better rights, and to improve the quality of living, especially after the massive inflation after the war and the following defeat. But then the Tsar sends in the military and secret police to silence the protesters. And the military forces of the Imperial Russian Army would end up massacring hundreds of peaceful protesters who were being led by an Orthodox priest on a day dubbed Bloody Sunday. Now, one of the larger protest groups were the Socialists, who were split between various parties, such as the Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, Social Democrats, Anarchists, and many other socialist or communist movements. But these groups began to form what are known as Soviets, essentially alternate local governments compared to the Tsarist governors and mayors. And these Soviets claimed to listen to the will of the people and become extremely popular even among non-communists. And as the riots and protests spread across Russia, it threatened to turn into an actual revolution instead of just mass unrest. And so many of the liberal and other non-socialist groups approached the Tsarist government and demanded that a constitution be written and that this constitution protect the rights of the people and give them an assembly of representatives to be elected to represent the various oblasts and states within Russia. Now, the Tsar eventually gives in to this demand, fearing that if he won't, then it'll result in an actual revolution that the army won't be able to put down. So he establishes the Duma, which is a parliament or Congress-like government structure with elected officials, and a constitution, although the way the constitution was written, while partially guaranteeing some rights, essentially said that the Tsar got to make all the decisions. And other than that, there were various other concessions and promises to reform the empire. Now, the way that the Duma was structured is that the Tsar could dismiss politicians and elect his own to represent these oblasts instead of their elected officials. And even then, the Duma had no real power if the Tsar felt they were not cooperating. So at times, he would end up dissolving all of the Duma and sending the representatives back home whenever they tried to push for any reforms that were too radical or that would weaken his power. And so he would end up canceling elections altogether and just appoint the members that he liked instead of those who were competent. And by 1910, things in Russia were beginning to improve, with Russia slowly beginning to industrialize, and people like Stolypin, a Russian minister, implementing many reforms, making life better for the rural peasants, and starting to build a middle class, especially in areas like the Ukrainian oblasts, with the middle class known as the kulaks, who were beginning to expand their farming and make it more efficient. Now, the aristocracy did rage against the expansion of Stolypin's reforms and trying to clamp down on as many of them as possible as it weakened their power in their territories. Now, fast forward to 1914, so 4 years later, and Russia is still super embarrassed by their defeat by Japan. The other world powers are making fun of them to losing to what a upstart empire that's not from Europe. And they're looking to regain their honor as a supposed great power. And so when World War I begins, Russia is one of the first countries to begin mobilizing, as they are hoping to gain some eastern territories in Poland and potentially even Germany. And Russia's also proclaimed itself as the protector of all Slavs, as Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire kept beating down on Slavic people within their empires. So when Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire is assassinated, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire sends in their armies to conquer Serbia in revenge. Serbia calls in Russia, and Russia immediately joins the call as they want to back up their Slavic ally. And at the same time, they call in France as they know they can't take on Germany and Austria-Hungary alone. Now, Tsar Nicholas, despite having no military experience, elects to take command of the Russian Imperial Army, despite never having previously shown interest in being a general or in martial leadership. As one of his aides on the night of ordering mobilization, phrased mobilization in such a way to make it sound like the Tsar had no real choice, because it would really just be left up to the generals. Now, based off of what I was saying before, if you're able to guess, the Russian army got obliterated in the First World War. They hadn't improved at all since their war with Japan, and with the Tsar in charge of the army, it only worsened those problems with the army not encrypting their messages, troops moving slowly, there not being enough supplies, and troops still being trained to inadequate standards. And with the ongoing famines, shortages of goods, and the upset of the people with millions of deaths and maimings and injuries all across the front, the people across Russia began to riot as the price of bread skyrockets. And they get extremely upset when they find out that the mystic Rasputin is being left alone in the royal palace with the Tsarina, who's a German woman, which greatly upsets the Russian people already, to the point where they renamed their capital St. Petersburg to Petrograd, so that way it sounds less German. But they believe that the Tsarina and Rasputin are cooperating to purposely destroy Russia from the inside. So mutinies break out all across the front line as soldiers and generals alike refuse to fight the Germans and Austro-Hungarians anymore, and even threaten to march on Petrograd and to take down the Tsar and his family. Now, in this, there are three main revolutionary groups, which is the Petrograd Soviet, which is led by Leon Trotsky, and later on Vladimir Lenin, when he arrives with help from the Germans to leave Switzerland, as he had been previously exiled for trying to start communist revolts. But Leon Trotsky is the leader of the Petrograd Soviet, and he is one of the Mensheviks. However, he cooperates with the Bolsheviks and Social Democrats and other communist and socialist groups that I mentioned before. And they want the complete destruction of the Russian monarchy, to seize the means of production, and to collectivize Russian agriculture, as well as form a so-called dictatorship of the proletariat. And they believe that by doing so, they will be able to spearhead their way to a communist utopia. There's also the provisional government, which is formed at the same time that the Tsar is removed from power, and is led by Alexander Kerensky, and he wanted to ensure a democratic nation like the United Kingdom or United States. So whether that be with a constitutional monarchy or the monarchy losing their privileges altogether, but they were waiting for the war with Germany and Austria-Hungary to end before they started these elections, as they believed the war would keep it too unstable. Now, some of the military forces and the various generals also were seeking to claim power, as there was lots of infighting between these generals, military forces, as well as them fighting with the Petrograd Soviet and the provisional government as they tried to stake their own claims. But the most successful of these military forces was General Kornilov, who attempted to seize power and march on Petrograd. However, out of fear that they'd be overthrown, the provisional government ended up arming the socialist militias. And so, as he was marching on Petrograd, the Soviets all across of the surrounding territories, made up of the different workers, cut telephone lines, they blew up railroad tracks, diverted the Imperial Army's trains, and ended up being able to surround Kornilov's army and force him to surrender. However, this ended up embarrassing the provisional government, as they ended up arming their rival government who was now able to take over Petrograd uncontested and break the truce they had previously had. Now, eventually, because this is around the time that the actual Russian Civil War starts, the provisional government and those rogue military forces that I mentioned before would form into what is known as the Whites, who were fighting the communists who were known as the Reds. And so these Whites had goals ranging from forming that aforementioned democracy with or without a constitutional monarchy to just restoring the Tsarist rule to even completely overthrowing the provisional government they had joined and forming a military junta to continue the war against Germany. Due to these wide-ranging goals and beliefs and different groups working together, they would stay disorganized with rampant infighting and corruption. And along with those factions, there was also the different nationalist movements, such as Ukraine trying to become independent, Belarus trying to become independent, the different Baltic states, the different Turkic countries. Finland was one of the countries who ended up breaking free and then having its own communist civil war. So it is all around very chaotic, and I will write up a video shortly to discuss the actual Russian Civil War. If you found this useful or entertaining, I'd greatly appreciate it if you made sure to like and subscribe. Thank you.